On the afternoon of May 23, 2024, the National Weather Service confirmed 17 tornadoes had touched down across Pottawatomie County, Iowa. In 6 minutes, they flattened every modern grain bin and steel storage building for miles. Everyone, except for a single, low, grass-covered mound built into a hillside in 1972. That mound was a root cellar, built by a 68-year-old farmer named Walter Gable. While his neighbors invested tens of thousands in sleek galvanized steel, Walter spent a summer in 1972 digging into that hillside with a shovel and lining it with fieldstone. His harvest survived. Theirs was obliterated. This is the story of why, when every expert said modern was better, one farmer bet everything on a method older than the country itself. Walter Gable was born on that same farm in 1956, the only son of Robert and Elsie Gable, and his first memory wasn't of a tractor or a harvest, but of the smell of damp earth and potatoes in the dark. His grandfather's root cellar, built into a gentle slope behind the farmhouse in the 1890s. A 12 by 12 room lined with limestone, with a heavy oak door and 3 steps down into a constant 55-degree chill. That cellar held the family's winter food every year of Walter's childhood. Carrots buried in sand, apples in wooden crates, potatoes in bushel baskets. It never failed. Not in blizzards, not in droughts, not in the economic freeze of the 1970s. But when Walter was 17 in 1973, his father made a decision that would change everything. Robert Gable stood at the kitchen window one August morning, watching a brand new Butler grain bin being erected 2 farms over. It was shiny, silver, and enormous, holding 18,000 bushels. It went up in 2 days, no digging, no stone, no summer of labor. The neighbor financed it through the local Production Credit Association with a 10-year loan at 7%. Robert turned to Walter and said the words that defined the next decade. "That's the future, son. We can't stay in the past. Let me tell you about the future that was sold to farmers like Robert Gable, because it wasn't just about storage. It was a complete reinvention of the American farm, pushed by banks, government programs, and a booming agricultural equipment industry. The message was relentless: get big or get out. Efficiency was God, debt was just a tool, and the old ways were a bottleneck to progress. The numbers were intoxicating. A modern steel bin could be erected in days, not months. It offered automated unloading, moisture monitoring, and insect control that a hole in the ground couldn't match. The USDA promoted on-farm storage loans. Tax codes favored depreciation on new equipment, and every issue of Successful Farming magazine was a glossy testament to steel and progress. By 1975, the Gable farm was at a crossroads. Robert, now 55, was facing pressure from all sides. His own father's cellar, while reliable, was too small for the yields they were planting. The local elevator offered a dismal price at harvest when everyone was selling. To capture better prices, you needed to hold your grain. To hold your grain, you needed modern storage. The bank manager, a man named Phil Jarvis, laid it out plainly over coffee in the farmhouse kitchen. "Robert, your equity is strong. Land's worth $320 an acre. We can finance a 30,000 bushel system for you, 2 bins, a wet holding tank, an automatic leg, the works. Your payment would be manageable. You'll make it back in 2 seasons with the price advantage." Walter, now 19, listened from the hallway. He heard the confidence in Jarvis's voice. He saw his father nodding, but he also remembered the cellar. The silent, sure cold of it, the way it had never asked for a payment. He waited until Jarvis left. "Dad, what about Granddad's cellar? We could enlarge it, dig back further into the hill." Robert shook his head, a weary gesture. "Walter, that's a season's work for you and me. Backbreaking work. For what? A damp hole for potatoes. We're grain farmers now. The money's in grain, and grain needs steel." The contract was signed in October of 1975. 2 Butler grain bins, model number 2150, galvanized steel, corrugated walls, conical roofs, rated for winds up to 90 miles per hour according to the brochure. Total cost, $28,000. Finance for 10 years. The acceleration clause was on page 4, standard for the PCA. The loan could be called if the collateral, the bins and the land they sat on, lost significant value. Robert didn't read that part. He signed where the tabs were. The bins went up the following spring. They were majestic. They gleamed in the sun. They made the old limestone cellar look like a relic, a forgotten tomb. For 3 years, the system worked perfectly. Robert held his soybeans until spring and sold for a 30% premium. The loan payments were made on time. The future had arrived. And then in June of 1979, a straight-line windstorm ripped through Pottawatomie County. Winds hit 85 miles per hour. It wasn't a tornado, not even close, but it was enough. Walter was in the machine shed when he heard the sound, a deep, groaning shriek of metal, followed by a crash that shook the ground. He ran out. One of the Butler bins, the one that was empty, had collapsed. The corrugated steel was peeled open like a tin can. The roof was 50 yards away in the cornfield. The other bin, which was 3/4 full with wheat, was leaning at a 20-degree angle, its foundation anchors pulled partway out of the concrete pad. The insurance adjuster came 2 days later. He walked around the wreckage, took photos, and consulted his clipboard. "Mr. Gable," he said, "your policy covers acts of God, but the wind rating on these bins is 90 miles per hour. The Weather Service recorded gusts of 85. This is considered a structural failure within the design limits. I'm sorry, it's not covered." The repair bill was $6,000. The leaning bin had to be emptied carefully with a portable auger, then dismantled. The Gables had to rent temporary storage at the elevator for that year's harvest, eating into their slim profit margin. Robert aged 10 years in a month. He sat at that same kitchen window, now looking at a scarred foundation and a massive repair loan stacked on top of the original debt. Walter, 23 now, finally spoke the thought he'd held for years. The root cellar never would have done that. Robert didn't get angry. He just nodded, his eyes hollow. No, it wouldn't have. Let me tell you about the conversation that happened next, because it's where Walter Gable's obsession began. It was a Tuesday evening. The repair loan papers were on the table. Robert was about to sign. Walter put his hand on the document. "Dad, what does it say? What are we actually agreeing to?" Robert looked up tired. "It says they'll give us the money to fix the bins, Walt. That's all I need to know." "That's not all it says," Walter said. He pulled the paper toward him. He read it aloud. The interest rate was variable, tied to the prime rate. The collateral now included not just the bins, but the farm's machinery. And there on page 3 was another acceleration clause. This one allowed the lender to call the loan if the operational viability of the collateral is compromised. Walter looked at his father. "What does that mean? Operational viability. If a weld cracks, is that compromised? If the paint fades?" Robert was silent. He took the paper back and signed it. He never answered the question. That winter, Walter started reading. He drove to the county extension office and asked for any studies on farm storage durability. He found bulletins from land-grant universities comparing storage methods. And in a dusty report from Iowa State dated 1968, he found a single paragraph that changed his thinking. It was a footnote, really. It described a survey of traditional root cellars in the Midwest after a severe tornado outbreak in 1965. The finding was stark. Of the 47 documented subterranean storage structures in the path of the storm, 46 remained fully intact and functional. The one failure was due to tree fall on a poorly constructed entrance. The report contrasted this with above-ground storage, which suffered near-total loss. Walter brought the report home. He showed his father. Robert read the paragraph twice, then handed it back. "That's then, Walter. This is now. We have different storms. We have different needs." But the seed was planted. Walter began looking at their land with new eyes. The gentle south-facing hill behind the house, the dense clay-based soil that held its shape, the location protected by a natural rise from the prevailing northwestern winds. He started sketching. By 1981, Robert was ill. The stress, the debt, the relentless pressure had manifested in a heart condition. He moved slowly. The operation fell to Walter, and the banks were calling again. Interest rates had skyrocketed. The variable rate on that repair loan had ballooned from 9% to 17%. The payment was swallowing them. Phil Jarvis from the PCA came back to the kitchen. The offer was different this time. "Walter, we can refinance the whole operation. Consolidate your bin debt with your land loan. Lower the monthly payment, but we need to update your storage to do it. Those damaged bins are dragging down your appraised value. We'll finance a brand new upgraded system. Bins rated for 105-mile-an-hour winds, the latest." Walter listened. He looked at his father, who stared at his hands. Then he asked the question Jarvis didn't expect. "What's the wind rating on a hole in the ground?" Jarvis blinked. "I'm sorry, a root cellar dug into a hill. What wind rating would you give that?" Jarvis forced a banker's smile. "Walter, that's not a serious storage solution for a commercial grain operation. This is 1981. It's a serious question," Walter said, his voice calm. "If a tornado hits, what survives? Your shiny new bins rated for 105 or 6 feet of earth." The meeting ended without a deal. Walter walked Jarvis to his car. As the banker left, he turned. "Don't let sentiment bankrupt you, son. Your father worked hard to modernize. Don't throw it away on a fantasy." Walter didn't answer. He walked to the hill behind the house. He stood where his grandfather's small cellar door was, and he knew he would not refinance. He would not buy another bin. He would dig, but he wouldn't just replicate the old cellar. He would build an ark, a subterranean vault large enough to hold not just the family's garden produce, but the heart of the farm itself, the seed stock for next year's crop, the genetic legacy of their land. He would build it to last a century, and he would do it with stone. Let me tell you about the summer of 1982, because that's when Walter Gable started digging and when his neighbors started laughing. The first shovel of dirt came out in June, and the laughter started by the 4th of July. Walter began alone with a spade, a pickaxe, and a wheelbarrow. His plan was simple but massive: a chamber 20 feet long, 12 feet wide, and 8 feet deep, carved into the heart of the hillside. He marked the entrance with stakes and string. He would work from dawn until mid-afternoon, then tend to the crops. The physical toll was immediate. Blisters became calluses. His back ached in a constant, deep hum. But every evening he would stand at the growing opening and feel the cool, damp air wash over him. It was the same smell from his childhood. His father, Robert, would watch from his porch chair, saying nothing. The disapproval was a silent, heavy thing. The first neighbor to comment was Arlen Foster, who farmed 600 acres to the west. He pulled up in his new Ford pickup one afternoon, a can of beer in his hand. "Heard you were digging to China, Walt." "Find any gold yet?" Walter leaned on his shovel. "Just clay, Arlen, good, tight clay." Arlen gestured with his beer can toward the half-finished hole. "You know what that is? That's a monument to stupid. I just put up a new soak-up bin. 42,000 bushel capacity, rated for 110-mile-an-hour winds. Took the crew 6 hours. What are you 2 months in?" "About that," Walter said. "And what's your hole rated for?" Walter smiled a thin, tired smile. "Rated for whatever the hill can take, Arlen, and this hill's been here a while." The story spread. At the co-op, at the diner, at the feed store, Walter Gable and his hole, the farmer who chose a cave over progress. Phil Jarvis, the bank manager, heard about it and drove out unannounced. He found Walter shirtless, covered in dirt and sweat, wrestling a large limestone slab into place as a lintel over the doorway. "Walter, we need to talk." Walter didn't stop working. "I'm listening, Phil." "This project, it's not just a joke anymore, it's a liability. You're sinking labor into a non-appreciating asset. You're not refinancing your storage debt. You're behind on your operating note because you're out here playing pioneer instead of farming. The bank's examiners are asking questions about your cash flow." Walter finally turned. "What's the appraisal on a hole in the ground, Phil?" "Zero, right? Can't secure a loan against it. Can't depreciate it. Can't call the loan if it loses value because it has no value to you. That's the point." Jarvis's face tightened. "The point is solvency, Walter. You have obligations. Romantic notions don't pay bills." "Stone lasts longer than steel," Walter said, turning back to the lintel. "And it doesn't come with an acceleration clause." By the end of that summer, the chamber was dug, but the real work was just beginning. The walls needed to be lined to prevent collapse and control moisture. Walter had chosen fieldstone, gathered from the edges of his own fields, stones pushed up by frost and plows over a century. Each stone had to be selected, fitted, and mortared. He couldn't afford pre-mixed mortar, so he bought bulk lime and mixed his own with sand from the creek bed. It was a slow, meticulous craft. He worked through the fall, then through the winter in a canvas tent over the entrance, a propane heater fighting the cold. His hands became cracked maps of cuts and mortar burns. Let me tell you about the cost, because while Walter was fitting stones, his neighbors were signing papers. Arlen Foster, emboldened by high grain prices, financed not one but three more high-capacity bins, expanding his on-farm storage to over 100,000 bushels. His debt load crossed the $200,000 mark. The bank loved it. His land value was soaring. He was the model of modern ag. Another neighbor, young Davy Krebs, just starting out, leased 15 acres and built a single massive steel warehouse-style storage building. Cost him $80,000, financed at 16%. It was a clear-span building, beautiful and cavernous for storing machinery and bagged seed. He told Walter it was the future. "You can drive a combine in there, Walt. Try that with your cave." Walter just asked, "What's it rated for?" Davy shrugged. The salesman said it was commercial grade. "It's steel, it's strong." But Walter had done the reading now. He knew what commercial grade meant in a catalog. It rarely had a wind rating. It was built to building codes for inhabited structures, not for the isolated, wind-whipped plains of Iowa. It was a fancy shed. 1983 brought the first test. Not a tornado, but a ferocious spring derecho, a line of thunderstorms with straight-line winds. The Weather Service clocked gusts at 92 miles per hour. Walter, his father, and his wife, Mary, took shelter in their basement. They listened to the freight train roar for 20 minutes. When it passed, they emerged to a landscape of minor chaos. Fence lines were down. A section of roof on the machine shed was peeled back. And out by the road, Davy Krebs's beautiful new steel building was a twisted sculpture. One long side had crumpled inward. The entire roof was gone, scattered across the adjacent field like wrinkled sheets of aluminum foil. The contents, a new tractor, pallets of seed, bags of fertilizer, were exposed to the pouring rain. Walter and Mary drove over to check on him. Davy was standing in the mud, staring at the wreckage, the rain soaking through his coat. He didn't cry, he just looked hollow. "Insurance?" Walter asked gently. Davy laughed, a short, bitter sound. "The adjuster was here an hour ago. Act of God. But the policy has a wind exclusion for structures not rated for the local wind zone. They're calling it improper construction. I'm arguing, but I don't know." The cost to repair was $30,000. Davy didn't have it. The lender demanded he rebuild to maintain the collateral's value. He had to take out another loan. The monthly payment on his storage now exceeded the payment on his land lease. He was in a trap. Walter's root cellar, meanwhile, was fine. A few puddles at the entrance, which he'd graded poorly. That was it. The stone walls hadn't shifted a millimeter. The temperature inside held steady. The news of Davy's loss traveled faster than the news of Walter's dry cellar, but a few people noticed. An older farmer named Harold, who remembered his own father's cellar, stopped by. He didn't say much, just nodded at the stone doorway. "My dad's was smaller, but it never flooded, never got hot." He paused. "What's it cost you to build it?" Walter did the math in his head. The tools, the lime, the sand, the few bags of cement for key spots. The wood for the interior shelves and the heavy door. About $600 in cash, and a lot of time. Harold whistled softly. "Davy's paying more than that just in interest every month." He walked back to his truck, thoughtful, but the mainstream momentum was against Walter. The agricultural economy was booming on paper. Land prices kept rising. Debt was just a number on a balance sheet. The idea of spending a year of labor to save $600 was seen as borderline insane, a failure to understand the time value of money. Phil Jarvis at the bank formalized this view. When Walter went in to make his strained operating loan payment in the fall of '83, Jarvis had a proposal. "Walter, we're restructuring some portfolios. Your farm is a problem. You have underutilized assets. That hill could be excavated, graded, made into prime crop ground. We have an appraisal that says you could add 20 acres of tillable land by removing it. We'll finance the earth moving. You'll increase your revenue, pay down your debts, and we can finally get you into proper storage." He slid a preliminary loan agreement across the desk. The collateral listed was not just the future crops but the land itself, including the hill with the half-finished cellar in it. Walter didn't touch the paper. "You want me to borrow money to destroy what I've built so I can grow more crops to pay back the money I borrowed to destroy it. We want you to optimize your operation," Jarvis said, his voice smooth. "This is optimization. That hill is wasted space." Walter stood up. "My grandfather stored food in that hill. My father played on it. I'm putting my family's future inside it. It's not wasted space. It's the only thing on this farm the bank hasn't put a price tag on. And I intend to keep it that way." He walked out. The meeting marked a clear line. Walter was now not just eccentric, he was adversarial, he was refusing to optimize. In the bank's eyes, he was becoming a bad investment. The pressure turned financial. The bank began to slow-walk his operating loan renewals. Checks took longer to clear. Requests for small lines of credit for repairs were denied. They were trying to squeeze him into compliance. Walter's response was to retreat further into his project. He spent every non-farming hour in 1984 finishing the interior. He built wooden shelving from reclaimed oak. He installed a simple vent system using PVC pipe to ensure air circulation. He hung a thermometer and a humidity gauge. He tested it through the seasons, learning its rhythms. The cellar maintained a perfect 52 to 55 degrees with a humidity around 80%, ideal for storing both root vegetables and keeping seed grain viable. He moved his most precious asset inside, his seed stock. Not just commercial hybrid seed, but the open-pollinated corn and soybean varieties his family had been selecting and saving for generations. The genetic library of their farm, immune to price hikes from seed companies. This was the final straw for the modern ag community. Saving your own seed was another step backward. It was denying the yield-boosting power of modern hybrids. It was, they whispered, almost a kind of arrogance. The summer of '84 was when the real pivot happened, not in Walter's mind, but in the atmosphere. The weather patterns grew strange, violent. The local news began running features on tornado preparedness. The insurance industry, quietly, began reevaluating risk models for agricultural structures. A report from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln circulated among extension offices. It analyzed the damage paths of recent tornadoes and found a curious, consistent anomaly. In the midst of total destruction of framed houses and steel buildings, there were pockets of survival. Often they were subterranean, basements, storm cellars, and yes, old root cellars. The physics were simple. Wind velocity is zero at ground level. Go down just a few feet and the force drops exponentially. A steel bin presents a vertical wall for the wind to push on. A hill presents a slope. A hole presents nothing. The report recommended that new storm shelters be built underground, but noted that many farmers were moving critical assets into above-ground storage that was, in a direct hit, defenseless. Walter never saw that report. He didn't need to. He felt it in his bones. He finished the root cellar in September of 1984. He built a final, triumphant feature, a set of massive, hand-forged iron hinges for the thick oak door. He bought them from a blacksmith, an unnecessary luxury. It was his declaration of permanence. He stood in the doorway looking into the cool, dark, earthy-smelling space, shelves lined with jars, bins of seed, bushels of potatoes from his garden. It was complete. That winter, Robert Gable passed away in his sleep. He never saw the cellar finished. At the funeral, Arlen Foster shook Walter's hand and said, "He was a good man, just wanted what was best for you." Walter knew what he meant. He just nodded. With his father gone, the full weight of the farm's debt and the bank's disapproval landed on Walter's shoulders alone. And on the morning of May 23, 2024, the sky turned a color he had never seen before, a green, bruised purple. The air went still and heavy. The weather radio screeched to life with a tone he'd only heard in tests. The voice was urgent, digital. Tornado warning. A large and extremely dangerous tornado is on the ground near Carson, moving northeast at 40 miles per hour. This is a life-threatening situation. Walter called his wife. "Mary, get to the basement, now." He looked out the window toward his fields, toward the hill, and then he did something his neighbors would never understand. He didn't run for his basement. He ran for his root cellar. He had to secure the door. The sound was not a freight train. It was the end of the world, a ripping, grinding roar that swallowed every other noise. Walter threw his weight against the oak door, slid the heavy iron bar into its brackets, and stood in the dark. The single light bulb on the ceiling swung wildly, then went out. He felt the pressure change in his ears, a sudden, painful pop. Then the vibration started deep in the stone around him. A fine dust sifted from the mortar joints. He could hear, or perhaps feel, impacts above, thuds, crashes, a terrible metallic shrieking that seemed to go on forever. He thought of Mary in the basement of the house. He thought of his fields. He thought of the iron hinges on the door. He did not think of the stone walls. They had been there for millions of years before him. They would be there after. 6 minutes later, it was over. The silence was absolute, a vacuum. Walter unbarred the door and pushed. It opened against a drift of wet dirt and shredded corn stalks. He climbed out into a new world. His farmhouse was still standing, but the machine shed was gone. Not damaged, gone. The foundation slab was scraped clean. His tractor, his combine, the farm all his father bought, all vanished. The fields were a tangled mat of debris and mud, and everywhere twisted metal. Sheets of corrugated steel wrapped around the trunks of snapped trees, aluminum siding from distant houses, and grain bins. Arlen Foster's 4 shiny soak-up bins were not just collapsed, they were unraveled. One had been carried nearly 300 yards and slammed into a stand of trees, its steel ribboned around the trunks like grotesque tinsel. Another was simply gone, leaving a naked concrete ring. Walter walked, numb, toward the road. Davy Krebs's steel building had ceased to exist. The concrete pad was there, with anchor bolts bent at 90-degree angles. The building itself was a half-mile away in a neighboring field, a crumpled ball of blue metal. But it was the sight to the west that made him stop and put a hand on a fence post for support. The tornado's path was a clean brown scar a half-mile wide, cutting across the county. And along that path, every single vertical storage structure, every grain bin, every steel building, every tall silo, was flattened or gone. It looked like a giant had stomped along the landscape, crushing anything that stood up. Then he turned and looked behind him at the hill. At the root cellar's door, a little muddy but solid. The grass on the mound above it was tousled but intact. The hill had taken the hit. The hole had survived. Let me tell you about the next 24 hours, because that's when the reality set in, not just of survival but of consequence. Mary was safe. The house basement had held. They had no power, no phone, but they had a hand pump on the well and the food in the root cellar. That first night, they ate canned peaches from a jar Walter had put up the previous fall, sitting on the cellar steps by lantern light. The smell of wet earth and fruit was the smell of life. The next morning, the first vehicles began to arrive down the battered roads: news trucks, National Guard Humvees, and insurance adjusters. Walter saw a sedan with a magnetic sign on the door picking its way through the debris. It stopped near what was left of Arlen Foster's place. A man in a clean button-down shirt and khakis got out, holding a tablet computer. He looked at the concrete rings, at the twisted metal in the trees. He scrolled on his tablet, tapped, then just stood there, hand on his head. Walter walked over. The adjuster introduced himself as Mark. He was from a major national insurer. He was trying to be professional, but his eyes were wide. "I've never seen the force," Walter nodded. "What's the verdict?" Mark gestured helplessly at the destruction. "Policies? They have specific wind ratings for these structures. Most of these bins were rated for 90-105 miles an hour. The Weather Service is estimating this tornado had winds over 200. He took a deep breath. "This is an act of God, but it's also total structural failure. There's going to be litigation about what commercial grade means for the buildings, for the bins. If they're rated for 105 and the wind was 200, that's well beyond design. It's a total loss. But the payout, it's based on depreciated value, not replacement, and replacement costs have skyrocketed." "How much will he get?" Walter asked quietly. Mark consulted his tablet. "For 4 bins of that age and capacity, maybe 60-70 cents on the dollar of original cost if he's lucky, and that's before his deductible." Walter did the math in his head. Arlen owed $200,000 on his storage debt. He might get $120,000 from insurance. He'd be $80,000 in the hole with no bins and no harvest to put in them if he had bins. He was bankrupt. And then Mark the adjuster asked the question that would change the tone of everything. "Sir, your property is just over there, right? I see your house is damaged but standing. Do you have any insured storage structures? Grain bins, machine sheds?" Walter looked at him. "I have a root cellar," Mark blinked. For personal use. That's not typically covered under a farm policy." "It's for farm use," Walter said. "Seed stock, seed potatoes. My harvest isn't in yet, but what I saved from last year is in there." "Is it intact?" Mark asked, a note of disbelief creeping in. "It's fine," Walter said. "Would you like to see it?" The walk to the hill was silent. Mark stepped over debris, his dress shoes sinking in the mud. When they reached the grassy mound and the oak door, he stopped. He looked at the door, the stonework, the hill. He looked back at the apocalyptic scene behind him. "You're telling me this was in the path?" "Dead center," Walter said. He opened the door. The cool, earthy air wafted out. Walter lit a lantern and led him inside. The light fell on the neat oak shelves, jars of canned goods, burlap sacks of seed corn and soybeans, bins of potatoes and carrots still firm. The thermometer read 53 degrees. The humidity gauge read 82%. Mark stood in the middle of the room, turning slowly. He reached out and touched a stone wall. It was cold and damp. He looked up at the arched ceiling of fitted stone. He let out a long, slow breath. "I have been to 14 farms this morning. You are the first person who has anything left, anything at all." He took out his phone and started taking pictures, not for the claim, for himself. What's it rated for?" he asked, almost to himself. Walter smiled for the first time in days. "It's rated for whatever the hill can take." By that afternoon, a strange pilgrimage began. Neighbors, shell-shocked and empty-handed, heard about the cellar. They came not to borrow, just to see, to stand in a space that was still whole. Davy Krebs came, his face gray. He didn't say anything. He just walked in, touched a shelf, and walked out. But it was Arlen Foster's arrival that marked the true turning point. He came at dusk. He didn't look at Walter. He stared at the cellar door as if it were a spaceship that had landed in his backyard. "Can I see it?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Walter nodded and led him inside. Arlen stood there in the lantern light, a man who had lost $500,000 in assets in 6 minutes. He looked at the sacks of seed. "Is that your seed corn?" "It is," Walter said. "The variety my granddad selected. It's not the highest yielder, but it's reliable and it's mine." Arlen reached out, put his hand on a sack. He didn't say anything for a full minute. When he spoke, his voice cracked. "I bought all my seed this year, on credit. It was in the building. It's gone. The insurance won't cover it. It was an inventory loss, not a structure." He looked at Walter, and for the first time there was no mockery, no superiority, just a profound, exhausted confusion. "What do I do now, Walt? I have no seed, no bins, nothing to plant in, nothing to store it in if I could plant. The bank will call my loans by fall. I'm finished." Walter didn't offer false comfort. He stated a fact. "I have seed, more than I need for my acreage. It's not hybrid. Your yield will be lower." Arlen's shoulders slumped. "Yield doesn't matter if you have nothing to harvest, will you? Would you sell me some?" Walter shook his head. Arlen's face fell. Then Walter said, "I'll trade you, seed for labor. I need help clearing my fields. My machinery is gone. You still have your tractor, don't you?" Arlen's tractor had been in a different shed, which was damaged but not destroyed. He nodded, a spark of desperate hope in his eyes. "Yeah, I do." "Then we have a deal," Walter said. "It was the first barter agreement in the county after the storm. It wouldn't be the last. Let me tell you about the bank's reaction. Because 3 days after the tornado, Phil Jarvis drove out. The bank was in chaos. Dozens of major clients were now insolvent. Collateral had literally been blown away. The bank's own financial stability was threatened. Jarvis looked 10 years older. He found Walter standing by his root cellar, talking to a state agricultural inspector who was documenting the survival of the structure for a FEMA report. Jarvis waited until the inspector left. He approached slowly. "Walter, Phil, I've seen the reports," Jarvis said, not meeting his eye. "About your cellar." He paused, struggling with the words. "The examiners from Omaha are asking about it. They want to know why one asset survived when every other comparable asset in the lending portfolio was destroyed. They're questioning the bank's risk assessment models." Walter waited. He knew what was coming. Jarvis finally looked at him. What is it? What's the secret? Reinforced concrete, steel beams. It's a hole in the ground, Phil, Walter said softly, with stone walls. The secret is that it doesn't fight the wind, it gets out of the way. Jarvis stared at the grassy mound, the unassuming door. The symbol of everything his institution had dismissed as worthless. We have a problem, he said, his voice flat. Your operating loan, the collateral clause. A significant portion of your collateral was machinery and stored grain. The machinery is gone. The grain wasn't in storage yet. Technically, you are in violation of your loan-to-value covenant. Walter felt a cold calm settle over him. This was the play. Even in the ruins, the bank was reaching for its clauses. The collateral clause, Walter repeated. What does it say exactly? Read it to me. Jarvis, taken aback, pulled a file from his briefcase. He read, the borrower shall maintain the agreed collateral value ratio. If the value of the collateral falls below 120% of the loan balance, the bank may demand additional collateral or call the note. And who appraises the collateral? Walter asked. The bank's appointed appraiser, Jarvis said. Well, Walter said, gesturing to the destroyed landscape. Get him out here. Let him appraise my root cellar. Let him put a value on a hole that's still here versus the steel that isn't. Let's see what the number is. Jarvis was silent. He knew he couldn't. There was no comparable. There was no market for used root cellars. Its value on paper was zero. Its value in reality on this day was incalculable. It was the only thing holding seed and therefore future income on this entire stretch of the county. He closed his file. The bank may be willing to consider a forbearance agreement, given the extraordinary circumstances. Walter almost smiled. You do that, Phil, you draw up the papers, and I'll read them, every word. As Jarvis drove away, a new vehicle arrived. It was a researcher from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, the one who had written the report on subterranean survival. He had driven 4 hours to see the cellar. He took measurements, photos, soil samples. He was giddy. Do you understand? He said to Walter. You have a perfect data point. You've demonstrated passive survivability. This isn't just an old method, it's a brilliant risk mitigation strategy. The cost per cubic foot of protected space is a fraction of hardened above-ground storage. We need to be teaching this. Walter handed him a jar of pickled beets from the cellar. Start with this, he said. But here's the thing that nobody saw coming, the twist that changed everything from a personal victory to a communal reckoning. As the days turned into a week, the scope of the agricultural disaster became clear. It wasn't just storage that was lost. It was the entire genetic foundation for the next planting season. Hybrid seed is typically bought fresh each year, but many farmers trying to save money had bought next year's seed early and stored it. That seed was now gone, soaked, scattered, or destroyed. The seed companies, overwhelmed, couldn't promise delivery of equivalent volumes in time for planting. There was a regional shortage. And Walter Gable, the man who read the old bulletins and saved his own seed, the man who built a vault to protect it, now held in his root cellar the most valuable commodity in 3 counties, viable, plantable seed. He wasn't just a man who had saved his farm. He was suddenly, improbably, the keeper of the future, and everyone needed a piece of it. The first barter was with Arlen Foster. The second was with Davy Krebs. By the end of that week, Walter Gable had a line of farmers at his root cellar door, and not one of them was laughing. They came with offers, not cash, because cash was meaningless now. They came with what they had left: a working skid-steer loader, diesel fuel in a tank, spare parts for machinery, days of labor. Walter and Mary set up a folding table by the cellar entrance. They had calculated their own seed needs down to the pound. Everything else was negotiable. Walter's ledger from that month is a record of an economy reborn from the ground up. Page after page of entries in his tight script. May 27, traded 50 pounds Gable open pollinator corn seed to D. Krebs for 40 HRS field clearing with his D6 dozer. May 29, traded 30 pounds Pioneer Relic soybean seed to A. Foster for use of his 12-row planter and driver for spring planting. June 1, traded 20 pounds seed potatoes to J. Miller for 200 gallons off-road diesel. He wasn't just trading seed. He was trading time, energy, and a chance to get a crop in the ground. He became, by necessity, the central planner for the recovery of a dozen farms. The bank saw this new economy forming and was powerless to stop it. Phil Jarvis called it a concerning pattern of non-monetary transactions. The Omaha Examiners called it the only pattern that might keep these loans from going into total default. If the farms could produce a crop, even a reduced one, they might make payments. Walter's seed was the key. And so, the bank made a decision that would have been unthinkable a month earlier. They approved Walter's forbearance agreement. Not only that, they offered a small, low-interest operating loan to help him rent replacement machinery. The collateral listed was unusual. It included the agricultural output potential of stored seed stock. They were trying to put a number on the unappraisable. Walter read the agreement in the bank's conference room with Jarvis and a new, younger loan officer watching. He took 20 minutes. He asked for one change. "This clause here," he said, pointing. "It says the bank has the right to inspect the seed stock for viability and volume. I wanted to specify that inspection is visual only, non-destructive. No one takes samples for testing. The seed stays in the sacks." Jarvis sighed but agreed. The change was made. Walter signed. The reputation of the root cellar spread beyond the county. Feature story in the Des Moines Register with the headline, "The Hole That Saved a Harvest," brought visitors from state agriculture departments and even FEMA. They all asked the same question: can this be replicated? The university researcher, Dr. Emmett Reed, became a regular. He and Walter walked the property. "The principles are ancient," Reed explained, excited. "Thermal mass, geothermal stability, subterranean wind shielding. But we've forgotten them in the push for above-ground efficiency. Your cellar isn't a relic. It's a prototype, a low-tech, high-resilience asset." He convinced Walter to let him instrument the cellar with data loggers, tracking temperature, humidity, and structural movement over a full year. The data would be used to draft new guidelines for passive agricultural storage in tornado-prone regions. But the most important meeting happened in late June. A man in a suit from a major seed corporation flew in from St. Louis. He met Walter in the farmhouse kitchen. His offer was direct. "Mr. Gable, we understand you've preserved several open-pollinated varieties, including the corn your family selected. That genetic material has demonstrated remarkable resilience in local conditions. We'd like to license it, to study it and potentially incorporate certain traits into our own breeding programs. We're prepared to offer a substantial sum." Walter poured the man a cup of coffee. "How substantial?" $200,000. "For a non-exclusive license and a bulk sample of your seed." It was more money than Walter had seen in his life. It would pay off every remaining debt on the farm. It was vindication in a check. Walter was quiet for a long time. He looked out the window at the hill. "That seed," he said slowly, "isn't just a product. It's a story. It's the story of my grandfather selecting for drought tolerance in the 30s, my father selecting for stalk strength, me selecting for flavor and storage. You can't license a story, and you can't put a check in the ground and watch it grow." He shook his head. "The answer is no, but I'll sell you a bushel of it at market price. You can study it all you want, but the rights stay here with the farm." The man from the corporation was baffled. He couldn't comprehend refusing the money. He left with a single sack of seed and a story he would tell for years about the stubborn farmer in Iowa. "Let me tell you about the harvest of 2024. Because it was unlike any other in living memory. The yields were lower. The fields, cleared of debris, still bore scars, but there was a crop. Where there should have been nothing but bankruptcies and auctions, there were combines in the fields. The sound was the sound of survival. Walter, Arlen, Davy, and 4 other farmers pooled their remaining machinery and labor. They moved from farm to farm, a communal harvest. The grain they harvested had to be stored somewhere. The temporary solution was a series of rented portable grain bags laid on the ground, a vulnerable temporary fix. And that's when the second wave of construction began. But this time it was different. Arlen Foster, instead of ordering a new soak-up bin, hired an excavator. He dug into a slope on the back of his property. He called Walter. "I need the plans for the stonework, and I need you to come look at my soil." Walter went. He showed Arlen how to test the clay for stability, how to shape the arch of the ceiling to distribute weight. He didn't charge him, he just said, "When you're done, you'll have a place that's yours, really yours." Davy Krebs built a smaller one, mostly with concrete blocks but dug deep and backfilled with earth. By the end of 2025, 7 new root cellars or reinforced underground storage rooms dotted the county. None were as large or as beautifully crafted as Walter's, but they were there. They were a silent, earthen rebellion against the assumption that newer and taller always meant better. The final accounting took years. Of the 13 farms neighboring Walter that were hit by the tornado, 4 were sold in foreclosure. The banks took massive losses. 3 more were sold voluntarily by farmers who were too broken to continue. But 6, including Arlen Foster's and Davy Krebs's, survived. They survived because of a chain of barter that started with a sack of seed from a hole in a hill. They survived because they were forced to cooperate, to step outside the system of debt and isolated ownership that had left them so vulnerable. Phil Jarvis retired from the bank in 2026. The stress of the disaster and its aftermath, he said, changed his view of risk forever. In a rare interview, he said, "We lent money based on appraisals of steel and land value. We never appraised community. We never appraised knowledge. We never appraised resilience. Those things don't have a line on the balance sheet, but they're the only things that matter when the wind blows." Let me tell you about the last meeting between Walter and Arlen Foster. It was in the spring of 2028. Arlen's new root cellar was finished, full of his own saved seed now. He walked over to Walter's place. They stood at the entrance of Walter's cellar, the original. The oak door was darker with age. The iron hinges had a patina of rust. "I came to say thanks," Arlen said, his voice gruff. "You know, for the seed, for the plans." Walter nodded. "You paid me back with labor. It was a fair trade." "It was more than a trade," Arlen said. He looked out at the landscape, which had healed but would always bear the memory of the scar. "You know what gets me? I spent $200,000 on bins that turned into confetti. You spent $600 and 2 years of sweat on this." He knocked on the stone wall. "And this is the only thing left standing from that whole chapter of my life. The only thing I own that the bank never really had a claim on." He paused. "Why did you do it, Walt? Really? You had to know we all thought you were a fool." Walter was quiet for a moment. "My grandfather built the first one because he didn't have money for lumber. My father abandoned it because he believed in progress. I rebuilt it because I read a footnote in a report that said things buried last. It wasn't about being right. It was about being here next year. It was about reading the fine print on the land itself, not on a loan document. The land said, 'Dig in, I'll hold you,' and I listened." Arlen extended his hand. Walter shook it. There were no more words needed. The reconciliation was in the earth beneath their feet. Today, Walter Gable is 76 years old. He still farms, with his daughter Sarah managing most of the work. The root cellar is still in use. Every fall, it holds the garden's bounty and the precious seed for next year. The farmall his father bought, the one that vanished in the tornado, was never found. But in the barn sits a different tractor. It's Davy Krebs's old John Deere, the one that survived in the damaged shed. Davy, when he moved away, couldn't bear to sell it. He gave it to Walter. "It belongs here," he said, "with the other thing that survived." The university's guidelines for passive, resilient agricultural storage were published in 2027. The cover photo is of Walter's root cellar door. In the appendix, there's a cost-benefit analysis comparing a traditional steel bin to a subterranean stone cellar over a 50-year lifespan, accounting for expected storm damage. The stone cellar wins, not just in survival, but in total cost. The report is dedicated to the farmers who remembered what the land already knew. And here is the final surprising detail. Inside Walter's root cellar, on the back of the heavy oak door, there's a message carved into the wood. It wasn't carved by Walter. It was carved by his granddaughter, Ellie, when she was 10 years old. She did it the summer after the tornado, during one of the many times she took shelter there from a summer thunderstorm. With a pocket knife, she carefully etched 6 words. They are small, easy to miss. But if you know where to look and you shine a light just right, you can read them. The message says, "The quietest room in the world," because that's what it is. When the door is closed and the world outside is screaming with wind or market chaos or doubt, it is silent. It is cool, it is dark, and it holds what you need to begin again. So let me ask you a question, the same one Walter Gable asked himself in 1982, looking at a hill and a bank ledger. What are you building for the storm? Not just the storm of wind, but the storm of change, of crisis, of the unexpected event that tears up the landscape of your life. Are you building something that looks impressive on a balance sheet, something that gleams in the sun and earns the nods of approval from every expert in the room? Or are you building something that will be there when the roaring stops? The story of Walter Gable's root cellar isn't really about farming. It's about time. It's about the difference between a 10-year loan and a 100-year stone. It's about the arrogance of the present moment, which always believes it has invented the best way to do everything, and the humility of the past, which whispers that some problems were solved a long time ago if we'd only stop and listen. We live in a world that optimizes for efficiency, for speed, for scale, and there is power in that. But efficiency has a hidden cost: fragility. A system with no slack, no redundancy, no deep roots is a system that breaks clean when the pressure comes. Walter's neighbors weren't wrong to want modern solutions. They were wrong to think modernity meant forgetting. They traded the deep resilience of the earth for the surface strength of steel, and when the test came, the earth held and the steel vanished. The lesson here isn't to abandon technology. It's to read the fine print on every promise of progress. To ask, what does this not do? What does it assume will never happen? And what will I have left when those assumptions fail? The quiet room in the hill is a choice. It's the choice to value permanence over convenience, substance over appearance, and survival over spectacle. It's the choice to invest in things that don't depreciate, can't be repossessed, and won't blow away. We all face that choice in different forms. In what we buy, what we build, what we believe, in who we trust. So look at your life. Look at what you're counting on to be there in 10 years, in 20. How much of it is held up by payments, by promises, by thin sheets of metal? And how much of it is built into the hill, stone by stone, understood by your own hands and paid for in full? Walter Gable is still farming. The cellar is still cold. The seed is still good. And the hill hasn't moved an inch. Thank you for listening. If you found value in this story, consider subscribing. More like it are on the way.